Climate change saves lives. Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. I'm here with the aforementioned Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. And gentlemen, I was fiddling around on LinkedIn earlier this week when I stumbled upon one of my favorite people to follow, whose name escapes me now because it's a social network. It doesn't mean I have to be sociable. And he linked to a chart on a website that I'm going to cite here called OurWorldInData.org, Our World in Data. And this is a chart indicating the, this is a weird word to say, but it makes sense when you read it, the decadal average, decadal meaning per decade average, of annual number of deaths from disasters. So these are deaths from geophysical, meteorological, climate events, earthquakes, volcanoes, landslides, drought, wildfires, storms, flooding, half of which, or more than half of which, those things are attributed these days to man-made climate change. And what I thought was interesting about the chart is that the chart peaked in 1920. It goes from 1900 to 2020. It peaked in 1920 and then fell off precipitously in the succeeding years. And after about from 1970 on, it goes from these really high peaks down to these really, really low valley indicators. And I thought, wait a minute, what's going on here? They're saying if you look at the average per decade deaths from these kinds of mostly climate-related disasters, it's actually plummeted since 1920. In 1920, the bar goes on the chart goes up over 500,000 deaths, and by 2020, it is well below 100,000. Looks to be at around 20 or 30,000, something like that. And I looked at the breakdown, the table that supports that chart, and it said that deaths from natural disasters worldwide have declined 74% from the decade of the 1900s to the decade of the 2020s. It would be even more than that if you jumped ahead and did just a 100-year cycle instead of 120 years, because there was a peak in 1920. In any case, so first of all, Steve Green, that fascinated me because I've heard that it's nothing but death and grief and sorrow and murder, as Steve Martin would say, when it comes to climate change, that everything is sad and glum. And here it appears that deaths are actually dropping off on a worldwide basis. I'll do a little bit of a breakdown in a minute for Bill's question. But is there some data, maybe if we're following the science, that we need to avail ourselves of? Maybe next time we hear something about how tragic everything is, do you think it's worth people's time to sniff around a bit?
Yeah, you counter all the doom and gloom, please. I mean, seriously, my only worry about the future isn't nuclear war. It isn't climate change. It's that we've got such piss poor leadership in charge of things that we're running up all this debt. That's my only concern. The planet's going to be fine. We're going to be fine as soon as we find some lampposts to deal with our current leadership. I'm kidding about the lampposts. You just need to vote the bastards out. Here's the thing, though, Scott. You're talking about this chart of the deaths going down, and what I would like to do is superimpose that against a chart I saw just a couple of weeks ago, and not for the first time, which is the explosion in human wealth. The number of people who, especially over the last 35 years since communism fell in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, since China adopted limited forms of capitalism, and also changes in India and Africa. The hundreds of millions, the billions of people that have been lifted out of poverty in the last 35 years. It's a miracle. It's the closest thing to a miracle you could possibly imagine happening in the modern age, except it's not a miracle. It's something people did just by being allowed to live their lives and to innovate and trade and all the things that people like to do that damn lefties smears, it's capitalism. Yeah, well, guess what? But the thing is, wealth saves lives. It's not exploitation. It's not any of that. Wealth saves lives. You talk about people not dying in natural disasters. If you don't want to die in an earthquake, live in a rich country, even one as earthquake prone as Japan, because they've got enough money to build buildings that are virtually earthquake proof. be in a rich country, and there are more and more rich countries. If you don't want to die in a hurricane, live in a modern house, even in some place like the Carolinas. It gets smacked every couple of years real hard, and you will live. Live in a rich country that has weather satellites. You can see the bad stuff coming and get out of the way in time. All of these things save lives, all of them take wealth, and all of that wealth is created by capitalism. So shut up, lefties, and your collectivism and your wealth-destroying, life-killing ways.
Now, Bill Whittle, I think Steve is right to a certain extent, although the breakdown now is going to challenge part of what he said.
No, I'm completely right.
No, he is completely right, as usual. But it's going to appear to challenge it. And this is, when I started looking at the lines of the table, it gives you country breakdowns, it gives you regional breakdowns of this decadal change from the decade of the 1900s meaning 1900 to 1910, to the decade of the 2020s. So anyway, I started looking at the breakdown and I saw, okay, well, worldwide, deaths decreased to 74%. It looks like among lower middle income countries, deaths from these disasters decreased 96%. So that's good. However, in the European Union, deaths actually increased a little bit by 61%. In Europe in general, outside of just the Union countries, it increased by about 70%. But here was the problem, Bill. Wealth can help you to a certain point, and then when you get to the upper middle income countries, deaths actually increased by 277%. Now again, that's going back to the 1900 instead of the 1920 baseline, which would have looked much more dramatic and much better. And we're dealing with worldwide, despite the tragic information in the news, worldwide relatively few numbers in modern times. But it almost seems like the increase in wealth that Steve was talking about was of greatest benefit to those countries that were in the toilet of poverty, rather than those countries that were somewhat well off and now are by world standards anyway, by historical standards, extremely well off.
Well, back in 2008, I want to say somewhere around in there, when the global warming thing was really starting to heat up, if you'll pardon the expression, I got a chance to listen to a guy named Bjorn Lomborg, who's known as the skeptical environmentalist, live in a very small group of people, 20 people.
I read one of his books. Good guy.
Yeah.
Yes, and one of the first things that he said that the predictions of the climate people say that there's going to be an additional 120,000 deaths due to heat stroke and so on. What they don't tell you is that 800,000 people are not going to freeze to death.
Yeah.
So that alone, right, just that out of the gate right there alone, we may be looking at a kinder, gentler climate. Everything that Steve said was basically where I was going to go in terms of there are many reasons why these numbers have gone down. Chief among them are advances in technology, which cost money. And his point about earthquakes, absolutely true. There's been a number of earthquakes here in Los Angeles that even like the really big ones like the Northridge quake or whatever, 3 people, 4 people die. If this happened in Tehran or if this happened in China, 12,000 people killed.
Turkey.
Yeah. And all of the warnings that you get from weather satellites and so on. But I think that when you say that there's a cohort that actually did worse, the only thing I can come up with is if you're in a hut on a beach and all of a sudden somebody has a weather satellite to warn you about that, yes, your survival rates are going to go up. But for these Eastern European countries that you were mentioning, I suspect what's probably happening is they've got enough technology to be able to build denser and denser cities, but not quite the level of technology yet where you build these things on springs like they do with downtown Los Angeles skyscrapers, where you've got enough technology to pack people in closer and not enough to really do that kind of, that final 15% of engineering that makes them essentially disaster proof or damn near disaster proof. One thing that all of this does show, though, is that the narrative that the Earth is becoming a horrifically out of control, violent, storm-tossed, tempest-ridden, earthquake prone, burning, frying, drowning, death trap hellscape is wrong.
Yeah, I think the reason I wanted to do a show about this was just to jar us to think a little bit, and myself especially. I go to the front of the line there because I had just heard a story earlier in the day about something about climate change, and I thought to myself, I'm not quite as crazy as I may appear, so I didn't like shout at the radio or anything. But I thought to myself, you know what? It's okay to suggest that the climate is changing because why wouldn't it? You know, it's part of
constantly,
slowly,
and constantly.
It's part of creation. It's part of the biosphere. You know, like everything is constantly in flux here. We would expect that, and it's not even a problem to suggest, in my mind, that maybe the Industrial Revolution had some small part in that, although I doubt that. But where the problem comes is to suggest that by government policy and by imposing taxes and regulations on people, we're suddenly going to reverse this planetary phenomenon, this actually solar system phenomenon. But we get we're spoon-fed the data that people who are advocates for one position or another want us to see. And what I love about this little graph is it shocked me. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. Like, it just seems like you hear in the news things are getting worse and worse. But if you look at these kinds of what used to be called natural disasters, things are getting incredibly better. Arthur Brooks has written several great books, and one of the things that Arthur is known for is talking about how phenomenally better it is to be on Earth at this time than it has ever been, how much better it is to live in the so-called third world than it ever has been. And so I just love seeing counter-narrative factual information. And I think, if anything, I propose this as a remedy and an alternative to ranting and raving when somebody disagrees with your opinion. Just go find some research, and don't just look for stuff that would support your point of view, but go start doing some digging and finding out what's really going on. I mean, when somebody makes a claim, how do they substantiate that claim? Is that really true? How could I find out? Are there multiple sources that I could consult to do this? And as I hear myself saying this right now, I think, oh, wait a minute, that's what they trained us to do when I went to journalism school. So I guess I would say now we all have to be journalists in the true sense of the word, because we can't rely on the journalists to be journalists. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.